Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Des Moines, Iowa, on Iowa Catholic Radio. Whether you're hearing us through the Iowa Catholic Radio Network on the airwaves, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, iowacatholicradio.com, or our wonderful, beautiful, fantastic podcast listeners, thank you for listening to the show. I work over at a place called Mercy College of Health Sciences, where I'm the senior advisor for mission initiatives. Bud, what do you do in this place they call Des Moines?
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences.
And I think it's worth noting that they have underwritten our show and have done so for 8 years at this point. Very relevant because, of course, we have been celebrating our 8 years. 8 years was last week, 8 years to the date. And so on this new trek through our 9th year of existence, we are going through and talking about, we're reconsidering the first clip of shows we did, which were about the principles of Catholic social teaching. But foundational to all of that, Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting our show. Thank you for doing so, mchs.edu.
Yeah, it's been kind of a slow start to fall in terms of the weather, but we are in full swing at Mercy College of Health Sciences. I don't know if I'm in full swing yet. Like last year we went to a conference at Notre Dame. And Notre Dame, I have to say, I've got maybe some complaints about their football program and things, but the campus is beautiful. We've got some good friends there, but the campus is beautiful. When I'm on Notre Dame's campus in the fall, it feels like a movie scene.
Right.
And so that sort of ambiance, the kind of like nip in the air, red and yellow leaves like falling to the ground, I need that to feel like it's truly the start of a school year.
I'll give you that. It has not been a colorful foliage.
I've always struggled over what causes it to be colorful. Some people have told me like if it's too dry, it's not as colorful, or
if it's too wet, or if it's too hot.
I'm not sure of the physiology there.
But I thought compared to where I've lived before, Iowa turned faster. But at least here in the middle of September, I mean maybe a few leaves, but not the sort of, like you said, the thing that makes you immediately think of John Leonetti drinking pumpkin spice latte with a scarf on.
It's been warm in September. I think some warmer weather maybe delays that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I do like the term fall foliage. In college, my wife had a brief relationship with a rugby player at John Brown University.
Okay.
And she likes to downplay like we were never officially dating.
Okay.
But they went on a fall foliage tour. I feel like that's, I don't know, once you take the fall foliage tour.
You know why I don't think it was a big deal to Rachel is because her family, maybe people don't know this, but they were in the Christmas tree business, right? So she's probably like seen that, like this guy's not even like paying attention. I don't think you had anything to worry about back then is my point.
There's a Seinfeld episode about that. Like if it's coffee, like what constitutes a true date?
So you
to me, fall foliage
trees,
once it involves shrubbery.
I think that the tree has to be evergreen before you have to start calling it an actual they were dating.
Fair enough.
Because otherwise it's just dead stuff, right? So yeah. Well, I'm with Rachel. I'm sorry. I don't think it was a date.
This got settled on air, and once it's on radio, it's official.
I can't wait for her to hear this.
She's going to have no idea. Yeah. I am excited about today's show, though.
Yes. Sort of related because one of the principles of Catholic social teaching is justice. And justice is about giving each their due. Sort of like injustice, was that a date or not? But no, more seriously, we're going to talk about justice and what that means, which can be very disputed in the modern world. But when we sort of come to terms of what we're getting at when we speak about justice, in what way does that provide the foundations of going forward, talking about Catholic social teaching and the many ways in which those concerns show up? Mercy, I think, Bud, being at the forefront of this, that justice and mercy are not two opposing forces to reconcile, but actually have everything to do with each other. So this is the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us all 8 years here at the Uncommon Good. As we've been talking about starting last week, which was the date of the 8-year anniversary, we are going to go through those first series of shows that we did, which I think, kudos to us back then in 2016, decided that we should first talk about the core principles of Catholic social teaching. And so we're going to reconsider these now in more depth. Those shows were 30 minutes. These are hour, but also hopefully, Bud, with 8 years of wisdom to provide for people. I want to once more laud us, younger guys back then, for thinking that after talking about peace as the tranquility of order as the first foundational show, that we decided the next one we had to talk about was justice. There's all sorts of ways to really order considerations of Catholic social teaching. I'll admit that for a lot of people, they start with human dignity, and that sort of makes sense in the modern milieu. To be a sort of dork about this, even historically, I don't think the church would do that, because dignity has its own sort of history and like considerations of human rights, and when that language starts to take over is, I don't know if it's complicated, but it's at least technical, and so sometimes that doesn't work out that way. I would say theologically is what we were going for. Is the world ontologically prior peaceful because God himself is at peace, or is it war and chaos and you have to wrest peace from disorder? So to establish that Catholic social teaching sees the primacy of peace, and that peace is not just an absence, but the tranquility of order, 2016, Bo and Bud then said, so justice, which very much by the old definition is about giving each one their due, would of course spring forth as the next thing to consider if peace is about the tranquility of order. So justice has to do with order, but man, Bud, maybe that's where we should start, because if justice and order belong together, then people start thinking of law and order, and then I think they think of violence, and then it falls back into that sort of Hobbesian Leviathan that we were worried about. So let's get started with justice. Maybe we should do it this way. When we've talked about that with our students, for instance, when we taught that class together, what do you think caused some of the confusions about justice? Because I have to argue, from Plato onwards, and he's reflecting an older tradition, most people would agree with the definition that justice is about giving each person what they're due or what they're owed. But as Plato's Republic, the very dialogue where he argues about this, then takes 10 more chapters after it explains the definition of the first one, to say that that's what justice is, to give each their due, maybe doesn't clarify enough out of the gate.
Well, and talking with our students about this, I think one of the most common misunderstandings in today's culture is that justice equates to fairness. And we tend to think of it, especially here in the States, as kind of the leveling out of all differences. And so justice is sort of equated with just like pure equality. And that starts with, obviously some of these things do relate to justice, but like access to certain things, like Jim Crow laws back in the day were clearly unjust. But does that mean that everyone has to have the same basic income? Or, like when we even think about opportunities, what's involved there? And classically, we can unpack this a bit further. It doesn't. Like when you say justice is giving each according to their due, that would tie into like, obviously you're going to treat a criminal differently than you do a newborn infant. And the fact that you imprison the criminal isn't unjust. That person can't say like, well, why does everyone else get to run free or whatever? Like something has happened to them that has led to these like certain consequences. And, meting out punishment, if handled properly, is precisely a form of justice. Similarly, like even when it comes to like gifts and natural talents, like there may be someone, I'll reach back in time a bit so I don't offend any like tradespersons who listen to the show, but like there may be a cobbler and that person was born into that guild and they're great at what they do. They may not be fit for the ruling class. And the fact that, like we say, we're going to tab someone else to govern us isn't unjust to the cobbler. It's actually contributing to the order and harmony of society. And that's where I think, like you're saying, we have to come back to the tranquility of order, because creation, like as God created the world, it was given a certain order and a certain harmony. And like you're saying, even those of us who like we're searching for the right understanding of justice, we can kind of distill it down to or refract it through this lens of like meting out punishment after something takes place. But in an original sense, justice was the harmony of creation where there was a right ordering between man and woman, between humanity and nature on down the line. And sin led to injustices, not because of a defect in God's creation, but it created a sort of disorder. And that's where even things like the relationship between men and women, like we should be careful about sort of like looking at how those relationships work out today and trying to like abstract a sort of like philosophical concept from that, where we have to go back to, I mean, John Paul II was great about this, that in the beginning, how did God intend and order things in the beginning?
Well, I think that you've set this up perfectly, because this is how the first show was directly connected to the second. That if you believed in primordial chaos and violence, then justice is about the fair access to what can be wrested from chaos. And so you think about even the social contract, right? I give up my right to use violence to claw and scratch out an existence, right, that Thomas Hobbes thought was mean and brutal and short, and I give the state or the Leviathan a monopoly on violence, and it's only fair, bud, this is where it gets, right, that if I do this social contract and give my power exclusively to the state, that they have to not only protect the borders, create peace out of the primordial chaos, then they have to be fair in how they give access to it. And so even though fairness sounds like a very positive thing, just like peace is a negation in the Hobbesian view, right? It's the absence of war. Fairness is the absence of restraint towards a common thing that only the state can provide. Mm-hmm. And that really what individuals have to do is make sure not to get it where other people can't have it, sort of deal. And so fairness can sound like it's a very positive thing, right? And of course, if you want to misquote us up and down, it can sound like Bud and Bo think that Christianity is inherently unfair. There's a way in which fairness, of course, comes up, but it's a second order consideration is what we're getting at. But Bud, why does fairness rise to the top in this other Hobbesian order? Well, because as we really stated, I think in the first episode, the new Leviathan can't have a final end in mind for anyone, right? There are no final goals. This is why the Leviathan doesn't care what you really worship, and why the Leviathan actually would rather absolutely enforce worship for the sake of order and peace, that's so-called, than actually care about the truth. Because there is no goal except wresting this peace out of the primordial chaos. And so justice has to be, at best, fairness of access to the fleeting goods that we would want to desire and pursue, as long as we don't get in the way of anybody else. But that's because that's all there is. Yeah. The justice you're speaking of, where we talk about a harmony of a hierarchical body, really, and like that's where some people get worried about this, the hierarchy of a body. But the harmony of something can only exist if we believe there's not only a beginning, like it was created by a creator, but that it has a final purpose. And so if you believe that justice is giving each their due to a harmonious order, that's because you believe there's an end or goal in mind of the activity of that body. So on one hand, you think of our bodies, and it's a good metaphor as far as it goes. You think of something like St. Paul talking about the body has to be differentiated, and some have more noble purposes than others, but precisely it's the most quote-unquote ignoble parts of our body that we cover, for the sake of honor and glory and all the things that he talks about. And that, sure, there's, like, if you had to decide between getting beheaded or cutting a finger off, you'd probably choose the finger, but that doesn't mean that the finger has no use or that it's, completely subservient. Without our hands, like our brains wouldn't develop, things like this. I think people will go, sure, but a body is like that way by nature. You could probably get really interesting arguments about, evolution throughout time. But even that being the case, it's certainly, let's talk about right-handed and left-handedness, bud. You can actually if you wanted to, train right or left-handedness out of a child. Like if you were really wanting them to be a left-handed pitcher, for instance, it would cause all sorts of problems and sadness and all these things like this, but you could probably do it. But if you let a kid learn to write right-handed because they're right-handed or left because they're left-handed, and that generally was encouragement of environment instead of nature, you would say, like, why wouldn't you just let the kid write with their right or left hand, whichever one that they prefer? And in the same way, right, like, okay, so it's not that we're not medieval peasants, and so we believe you have to be a cobbler if you don't want to. But even when we sort of like open up people to pursue their talents, this gets down to this idea that, okay, we're going to open it up. The goal is to help people with their talents contribute to a greater whole and harmony. And so justice is no longer, well, you're a cobbler, that means you're the foot of the body politic. And so, like, you belong in this, like, hierarchy, but you have these obligations. Even if it's like, okay, we're going to try to open the field for people to pursue other talents, justice is like, okay, but we're not just going to roll dice to decide what positions people have. So let's not even think of ruler. It's not like, okay, well, who's going to play piano for the New York Philharmonic? Sorry, not piano, violin. It's not like you roll a dice and you're like, Bud, it's you. And you're like, I've never practiced. And you're like, well, we're being fair, right? So even when it comes to talent, at the background of it all, we do know that there's something more than fairness. Like, we should be fair. Fair means about, like, not improperly precluding people from this harmony. I think that's what it means. But that's secondary to this idea that there is a harmony, that we try to give each one what they're owed in this harmonious order.
Well, and all of these considerations should transform the way that we talk about important issues. Like, I feel like there's a lot of slippage even in Catholic circles around, like, take a topic like war. And when we think about justice, sometimes we think like, well, if something's bad's done, there should be a response that's strong enough that it discourages the evil person from doing it again.
Right.
But even when it comes to meting out punishment, I feel like the Catholic tradition has always been about, we use the phrase restorative justice, but it truly is medicinal. So you take an issue like war, you know, in America, sometimes we'll say things like, if we don't do something, then their sacrifice will have been in vain, or like our enemies hate us because of our freedoms, or like we have to spread liberal democracy to parts of the world that don't experience it. Like, that's not really thinking about that matter through a just war lens. Like, a just war lens would say, is the good that's going to be achieved greater than the evil that's being prevented? Does the enemy have like a clear demarcation about what they need to do to surrender? Like, there's all these like very specific considerations, and those of us who take the time to talk about these things should figure that out. It's the same way, even like, take a really like sort of heated topic like capital punishment. Even with capital punishment, it's not really a matter of like, sometimes we talk about like the pain caused to the family of the victim. Sorry about the stuttering there.
No worries.
And that's, you know, to see that firsthand, that's really difficult. But as Christians, we have to be able to say, it's not about seeking vengeance. That even in that case, and you and I have talked about this in different contexts, like in the Middle Ages, it was really important. And when we talk about the Middle Ages, I'm not always saying it was like this perfect society, but I think they did this part better. It was public. There was usually there's supposed to be an opportunity for the perpetrator to have the chance to confess his sins and to like be right with God before this event. And so even in that sense, it was penitential or restorative with your divine maker. Today, you know, something totally different is going on. And then finally, I know I'm kind of jumping around a bit. Even something as difficult sometimes for Catholics to talk about as the doctrine of hell. Mm-hmm. Like, we should not think of hell as just like God sort of like working out his anger on persons, you know, like it really is, like, as I understand it, hell is the experience of God's love for those who have ultimately like rejected it and turned away from it. And, you know, like if you've ever like offended your parents in some way and you truly have loving parents, to know that like that's a painful experience. And that's kind of analogous to someone who's closed themselves off to the free gift of God's love.
Well, and I think that's why, I mean, we're already sort of hinting at this, that justice and mercy in the Catholic tradition have much to do with each other instead of being sort of these, you know, poles that are opposed to each other that we have to sort of in some mystical, profound, contradictive way reconcile only after life is over. It can seem like in this life we can't be just and merciful at the same time, but again and again, Scripture calls us back to saying justice and mercy shall kiss. So not what we were going to talk about today, and certainly not what we talked about 8 years ago. I think you're right that hell even is a place where justice and mercy kiss and come together in a way that it's hard for us to imagine. So we can't go into that. But I think that that's something to even sort of consider, that we believe even in meting out punishments for the sake of justice, that even the justice that is meted out should be considered as somehow merciful to some aspect to the perpetrator. Now, what's funny, of course, is this is where Greek and Hebrew thought don't go against each other. They don't blend, but they certainly have been rubbing up against the same difficulties and asking the same questions. Famously, Plato has Socrates talking about this in his dialogue to Gorgias, where he goes, actually, justice is merciful to the person who wants to be rational, because what justice is a rational response to the irrationality of being unjust, of committing unrighteousness, or of doing something against someone that we shouldn't. It's a whole huge argument, but really Socrates is trying to say that the best thing that someone should want if they've done wrong is to be appropriately punished, because it sort of brings them back to the realm of humanity, because human action is grounded in rationality. So weirdly enough, he sort of sounds like St. Paul, where St. Paul says the worst punishment that can be meted out is to leave you in your wickedness. And it even, certain parts of the scripture, that's what St. Paul said. I think it's Romans, where he says that's what God did, is he allowed them to fall under their sin completely in the hopes that they would come back around and repent. And what's funny is I've heard people say, look, that's God being cruel. But then if you ask anyone who does something like addiction recovery or works in like 12-step programs, they'll say, no, this is just God being honest about rock bottom, right? That some people, they have to hit their rock bottom. We want to be there to help them when they do that. But there's not like, when people have behaviors that are self-destructive, most of the time it's not like they're ignorant and then you tell them like, hey man, doing that's bad, and they're like, oh yeah, you're right, thanks, and they snap out of it. Some people have to, hit rock bottom, and to be there ready for them, which usually means, Bud, giving them restrictions, not allowing them the complete freedom to do whatever they want. You start to think about what recovery from addiction looks like, and you start to see what it means to say, it is merciful and loving to be just to people, and that the worst thing you can do is just let them do whatever the heck they want until they unravel into their destruction. That basic sort of reality is the basis of saying justice is about giving each what they're due, but not just simply as simple deserts or punishments, but in the hope of returning to a harmonious order, and that even when we punish, like you said, we want to restore as much as possible back to that harmonious order, but you have to have an idea of a goal or telos or a final reason that we all exist together in the first place for that to work.
Yeah, becoming Catholic helped me to see this in a totally new light, and it's really through. So it's funny because in conversation sometimes with Protestant friends and relatives, there are parts of Catholic faith that seem very foreign and wrong-headed to them, and one of them is like penance, or relatedly the doctrine of purgatory, because, well, to give a really kind of like illustrative example, so there's this prominent New Testament scholar, N.T. Wright, and I was reading a book that he was written about some of these matters, and when he gets to the doctrine of purgatory, he just quotes Romans 8, like, therefore there is now no condemnation in Jesus Christ, and he thinks like this is just like a biblical proof text that dismisses the doctrine. Yeah. But you actually start walking.
Thanks, NT. No one's read that. Anyway, sorry.
You start walking through the entire Bible, not simply the Old, but also the New Testament. And there's so many occasions where God's mercy, which the psalmist tells us, God's mercies are new every morning. God's mercy enables this radical forgiveness. So you think of someone like Zacchaeus. But when Christ forgives Zacchaeus, he doesn't say to him like, now the past is totally forgotten. Mm-hmm. He says he wants him to return, I think, fourfold what he's taken from other people. And so God's mercy is, I think we could call it infinite. It's new every morning. It enables radical forgiveness, but that forgiveness, again, is always a path towards wholeness. So when we practice penance, when we set right wrongs that are done, even when we recognize that there are some of the blessed who have to pass through purgatory before the fullness of the beatific vision. None of those things are against mercy.
No.
They're both just and enabled by divine mercy.
And I think that is it. So like people go, oh, so you think like God's like this some sort of accountant,
Just like the balancing of the
right? And he's
scales.
going to, and you go, no. It's even more insane than that, friends. He thinks you should be perfect as your Father in heaven's imperfect. And to the Zacchaeus point, he doesn't say, Zacchaeus, just make right what you did because I was counting, the columns. He goes, exceed what you did wrong so you can be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. Interesting stuff. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Wonderful to have you with us. We have been talking about justice because it's been 8 years, and we're reconsidering the foundations of Catholic social teaching, just like we did the first run of our shows 8 years ago. So talked about peace, the tranquility of order last week, talking about justice today. But when you bring up justice, it's one of those words that has a lot of adjectives placed before it. You, for instance, were talking about retributive justice versus restorative justice, and then I think most people, when they think of justice, they think of something like legal justice. What would you say people are thinking of when legal justice?
I mean, when we talk about legal justice, we tend to think of the laws of the land,
right.
And it's interesting because in our context, sometimes when people think about legal justice, they just think in sort of so when we talk about God, sometimes there are some wrong-headed theologies that have a voluntaristic conception of God, that God can, so to speak, like do whatever he wants because he's God. And so something is just because God does it. In the same way with our legal code, there's sort of this perception like, well, it's kind of like the arbitrary rules that society makes up to keep things in order. And we sort of get that in our heads because of things like the speed limit.
Yeah.
And it's like going down the highway, should you drive 45 or 60? And we set this kind of like, there's just this number. I mean, obviously safety considerations and things are there, but we've sort of lost this sense that comes from scripture, but it's threaded throughout the classic philosophical traditions that the law is a pedagogy.
Yeah.
And so even when it comes to justice, our legal codes, though some are not arbitrary, but they're malleable, all of them, when written well, are meant to make us more virtuous persons.
And I think you set this up perfectly. The law, as we think of it, not like the law, talking about God's law, because, you can go Thomas Aquinas, there's multiple, eternal law, human law. But if we're talking about positive, legal, juridical law, law on the books, that is an expression, like you said, of human work that points to justice. It's not justice itself. So funny enough, you can have unjust laws, and that's the proof of this, right? Yeah. Now, an unjust law doesn't have to be followed. We can talk about all that. But so there's laws that point to justice. So societies, for instance, like let's talk about like ones before there was even the ability to write, could still have justice because justice, so to speak, is primordial, right? What everyone is owed, what every creature is owed, actually even predates us. There's justice outside human community. Our laws is a way that we express that justice. But more specifically, talking about adjectives before the law, traditionally in Catholic social teaching, there's three that set the foundation of everything else. So classically, that would be commutative justice, distributive justice, and then social justice, which, let's be honest, might be the most maligned and misunderstood that there is. So let's start with commutative justice. It doesn't mean things that are spoken, but like it's good to think of communication. What does it mean to commune? It means the interchange between two people. Commutative justice, in a way, this is to oversimplify it, is anything that deals with contracts between two people. Yeah. And so this is the sort of justice that I don't want to say has the least natural connection to things, but this is where there's a lot of sway. So for instance, if you and I, like if I had an old Nebraska football card that you wanted and it was rare, I could make a contract with you where you agreed to pay me like $5,000 and someone would come in and try to be like, but that paper is only worth X amount, right? Or and they could even say, but actually if you go look at the trading card market, Bo is still ripping you off, but you can decide, I want this so bad, and I want to make sure, for other reasons, I want Bo to know that I'm really glad he found this card and is willing to sell it for me. As long as we are honest with each other, forthright, and we come to that agreement, commutative justice is much more malleable.
Yeah.
So it's it's not just contracts themselves. It's just this type of justice that's expressed in contracts where parties make agreements between themselves. And so that's where it's like, okay, you can't lie to each other. You can't be withholding evidence, right? It's best practices to go try to look on a market and see what these things do, right? A lot of it is coming to terms before you make the agreement, but commutative justice is what I think would show up in a lot of courts about torts, for instance, like that. And so that's sort of the first level of what we mean when we talk about justice.
Could I ask you a question about commutative justice?
Sure.
So when you mention contract, there are very obvious situations or scenarios like buying a car.
Mm-hmm.
You set up a contract with the car dealership. Even I think with our work responsibilities, so if you're employed at a company, there's obligations and responsibilities both directions. Like I owe my supervisor certain time at the office in exchange for a salary and whatnot. Would the covenant between husband and wife and the relationship of father and children?
So this is a huge discussion within Catholic social teaching that we're not going to be able to get into if we want time to hit everything. However, notice that one thing can have at least two aspects of it. So Leo the 13th, for instance, was insistent, and then you see this with Catholic social teaching, that there is a commutative element to marriage, right? The husband and wife enter into this contract between each other. Just because contract to us doesn't seem to have a sacred connotation doesn't mean that, for the past, contracts were sacred things. Like you said, covenants, right? It's only us who so easily break contracts and covenants. He thought this was important to show that the state does not have the authority to enforce marriages, right? So the monarch or the state or the body politic can't of their own right just demand that people get married. Even if you have something like a matchmaker or even sort of arranged marriages, there's still the idea that those two have to enter the contract, right? So think about when it comes to reasons why someone would be able to get an annulment is if they had no choice in the matter of getting married. That's a consistent grounds for annulment in the Catholic Church. So yes, it's always a contract, a community element of commutative justice between the two. However, it's a matter of social justice because marriage is so foundational to the social order. And if marriage is, so to speak, damaged or withheld from those for which it's owed in general, the whole body politic suffers. So it is the case that one sort of reality can pertain to multiple aspects of these. But yes, there's always a commutative, social, covenantal relationship aspect to the justice between man and woman.
That's really helpful because I had a friend in graduate school who was kind of trying to deconstruct the Christian understanding of marriage. And he was making this point that marriage used to be all about financial considerations. And it's sort of it was really sort of about property and things like that. But with what you just said, what's sort of more integral to the question of justice among human beings than precisely those sorts of questions? If our most important relationships didn't come with obligations and sort of if we have children together, this is injustice what we owe them, even at the level of the inheritance that we would pass on. In some ways, it's a fraying of justice that we've kind of lost that sensibility. That's just an easy contract to back out of without sort of serious obligations to your progeny.
Absolutely. And to think that, how property would pass through the generations is somehow mean and disgusting to consider because we're supposed to be romantically talking about love. Those don't have to dispel each other. Once again, the idea of bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, the two become one. How do you really show that is you go, hey, we're going to share all of our crap together. We're going to live in the same place and we're going to throw together our common interest in our livelihood going forward precisely for the sake of progeny. Absolutely. So the contractual, right? You have to come and say, I do to this mutual contract. The second one, distributive justice, it can get hard to define this one. I usually start with the example for this one. This is how we divvy up things that can't be bought or sold or agreed to on a one-to-one basis. So Russell Hittinger, who's my guide in all of this, who really helped me out on this, he always threw out this example. He goes, if I have a spring that I bottle the water, and I say, I'll sell this to you for $1 or I'll sell it for you for $2, and you agree and you purchase it, that's commutative justice. However, the river, right, that we're all going to mutually use, like the Des Moines River in Des Moines, you can't do that. No one owns the river. It's a common resource, and so it's a matter of distributive justice, right? When we have a common thing that we have to use in common, how do we distribute that thing among different users? And notice, Bud, this is where we get to the very idea of, this is why we don't believe in out-and-out fairness as a primary aspect of justice, the secondary one, because if we go, okay, everyone in Des Moines gets the equal share of the Des Moines River to use, I mean, that's silly, right? Because who needs to use it more? Well, like the hospital would, right? Like they need more water because they're caring for us. Or, I don't know, maybe we should have a water treatment plant and we all use it, and okay, yes, people who use it more will need to pay more, et cetera, et cetera. But the distributive justice is how we ask a common resource that can't be meted out one-to-one with a contract. What does everyone do out of that common resource?
Do you have any thoughts on, I'm giving you the hard questions today. So historically, it seems to me easier to consider because these conversations were more localized, and some of the, like you mentioned the Des Moines River, like there are certain resources that it makes sense, like this, it kind of belongs to this community, or they're the group that will like discuss this. Now, even with water, like I know Nebraska and Colorado, there's a little bit of a debate right now about who has...
Solve it on the field.
Yes, that's right. But that, I feel like in our world today, like some of these considerations get globalized. And when we think about some of the recent sort of like injustices, how do borders play into this whole conversation about distributive justice?
I mean, this is massive because one of the questions starts to be, anything that's asking whether something should be a public utility or not is grounded in this. So many people act like, it's just a choice. Like you say tomato, I say tomato. You say individual electric companies and they say, national grids. The problem starts to be because, I know I've said this fallacy myself with my own lips, talking about either medicine or the electric grid, is someone will go, well, something can't be a natural right that used to not exist, right? If a caveman didn't have it, then how could it be a natural right now? How could there be a natural right to electricity, Bud? Well, of course, this goes back to, it's not a matter of rights or fairness or thinking about it in that way first. Those are secondary to more primary principles of consideration and justice. And so one of them is, if we're talking about justice as harmony, the tranquility of order, but I simply ask you in Des Moines, could you live as a harmonious member of society without electricity? No. And the thing is like, this is different depending on where you're at. This is how a principle has to be lived out prudentially, and that the context matters, but the principle doesn't change. And so it's absolutely true that maybe if you live in the Northern Circle and you're used to only having electricity intermittently or only for like very specific things, you can talk about a ruler being perfectly distributively just in saying, electricity is just for people who want to use it like for extra stuff. But in Des Moines, how could people live through winter, for instance, without electricity in Des Moines?
Yeah.
And so you start to go, it's a matter of distributive justice. We have to ask, how is it that we can, in a just manner, make sure people have access to it in order to live harmoniously in at least the city that they live in? And so, yes, this has everything to do with borders, because if we sort of drew up borders where one state couldn't get water, or one country couldn't get access to a resource, or one country's colonized another and then exploits, those resources and doesn't let locals use them, that has everything to do with distributive justice.
Well, we'll get to social justice because we're running a little short on time, but one last thing about that. I think that's really helpful when it comes to, I'm blanking on the name, but Pope Benedict XVI, he had a social encyclical, and he mentioned in there that some of these considerations are international. Mm-hmm. And I know some people in my social media feeds kind of freaked out because they're like, Pope Benedict's calling for a one world government, and we can talk about this more when we do the episode on subsidiarity, but the world is ordered in such a way now that I think so that sort of idea could certainly be abused and exploited. But you talk about colonization, and we can talk about like economic colonization. So today in our country, I mean, for better or worse, smartphones have become ubiquitous, and there's lithium batteries, right?
Yep.
And those have to be extracted from certain parts of the world. And in some cases, the way that this is done is pretty horrendous. And so I think Benedict was attuned to those sorts of concerns. And he says, like, with the consideration of subsidiary, like, things should be addressed at the most local level possible. But sometimes economic dynamics and political conflicts, they unfurl in such a way that you almost need sort of like an international body that can intervene, or at least arbitrate those disputes.
And so, like, I mean, you don't have to believe there's a world emperor. Although, let's be honest, like, just to be shots fired here for a moment, that's what medieval Christians wanted with a Holy Roman Emperor in Christendom, right? Yeah. And they wanted the papacy to be an arbiter between rival claimants to thrones. I mean, so it's not as weird in Christianity as people let out. And if you don't have an international law court, what you have is the court of the international market, black markets or otherwise. Someone is going to, quote unquote, rule on these things, bud, and it's not always pretty when it's not a specific authority granted that power to do so. The last one is social justice. On one hand, for whatever reason, it's sort of become the marker of supposedly caring about, non-economic matters of justice, it seems to me, right? Social justice is usually considered like what left-wing people or liberal people care about. And a lot of people who talk about social justice, very honestly, don't do it any favors, because it's like the most amorphous sort of sounding aspect of justice when people use it. I don't think I'm being unfair here, right? It can cause confusion. But in the tradition, social justice is the consideration of anything that if someone is owed it, the only way they can have it is if we all share it together, and that the breaking of it, as it were, for any one person severely hampers it or breaks it for everyone else. And so one more time, appealing with Russell Hittinger, he goes, when the northern states in the Civil War, like when Lincoln wrote what he did to say that the South had no right to cede from the Union, he was making an appeal to social justice, because union, right, the union of the states can only happen insofar as the states stay unified with each other. So the injury, right, of the states ceding from the Union was not just contractual. So you'll hear people go, oh, well, by this or that state constitution, they had the right to do so. What Abraham Lincoln was appealing to is the reality of the social justice term of union cannot be had if the various states feel like at any moment they can leave at any time, and that they decide to do so. And he thought it was justified to go to war to fight over that principle of social justice. You think about in terms of the arguments of what was going on against Jim Crow laws, for instance, right? Instead of fairness, bud, where, like, again, fairness sounds like, oh, this is going to be this great principle that will be able to conquer all difficulties. But people running around between the 1850 to 1950 thought they were being fair because they had a racial understanding of what fairness is. Much more important, and you see this with the great civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, is appeal to the social justice, right, that you cannot say you believe in things like life or liberty or the pursuit of happiness and then treat an entire group of people within your union as if they don't participate in it. This is sort of, for me, most eloquently put by Frederick Douglass in his masterful speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, where he enumerates principle after principle that supposedly is the foundation of the social justice of the United States, and says that the United States abrogates all of them by how they treated African Americans throughout the history of slavery into Jim Crow. And so that's why social justice can seem amorphous, because it's, as it were, but the sort of biggest, most universal aspects of justice. But they're important because if one person is denied it, it seriously injures, if not hampers, everyone's ability to participate in it.
Well, this is the whole theme of our show, right? Like, we wanted to draw from the rich treasures of Catholic social teaching. And we all know that in today's context, like, sometimes social justice becomes kind of a dirty word. And what I mean by that is, like, I don't know, I see memes online about if your pastor's preaching about social justice, like, find a different parish, or, you know, like the term SJW, social justice warrior,
Right.
that's usually derogatory, you know, things like this. And what we want to say on the show is, like, as followers of Jesus Christ, as members of the mystical body of Christ, we have to be concerned about justice. And the fact that some do it poorly, or, you know, your annoying uncle takes an important topic and runs with it in the wrong direction, that shouldn't stop us from thinking about these things. And you know what? Sometimes the debates are uncomfortable, but I would rather have a bit of discomfort and really be seriously concerned about, like, the reality of injustice is in our midst. Not that we can create a utopian society tomorrow, but how, as Christians, like, what is our responsibility? How do we respond to these concerns in light of the gifts that the church has given us?
And I think this will finally end up in one of the things I will propose is at the end of us, like, recounting what we did in that first series of shows, that there's further shows that I think we are better equipped to talk about now to suss some of this stuff out. So, for instance, the relationship of forgiveness as a political act that Jesus Christ sort of, in some ways, created in a sort of new way that the political order at the time didn't know what to do with, and that we still struggle with. And another, of course, is just the common good itself, which is not, of course, just the aggregate of goods we all have, but goods that can only exist if we share them. Again, one more time, the sort of basis of our very show. So this is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. It's been 8 wonderful years doing The Uncommon Good, and so we are back going through and reconsidering the first series of shows that we had 8 years ago, talking about the fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching. Last week, we got to talk about peace, the tranquility of order. And Bud, we got to wrap up justice this week. I hope we, you know where this joke's going, did justice to the topic.
Oh, I hope we did. I think we did.
I rule us and say the verdict is not guilty of doing a bad job.
Like, we were joking during the introductory part of the show, like, my wife might object to this show, but hopefully on the whole, let me know how I can practice restorative justice for making college dating shenanigans during the intro.
Well, but if we want to do justice to the prayer life that we have here on Iowa Catholic Radio, what are ways that people can do so?
When you asked me that question a few seconds ago, the reason why I paused uncomfortably was I pulled up our schedule online.
Oh, yeah?
And I think they changed the rosary schedule without sending me a memo. So according to the Iowa Catholic Radio website, we pray the rosary on air at 4:30, at 10 a.m., and then the Chaplet of Divine Mercy still right before 3, so 2:55. But yeah.
Double check your Iowa. So go to iowacatholicradio.com. You can check out the schedule. You can also check out events to see the schedule of events. The big one coming up is we have Christ Our Life Conference, which will be September 28th through 29th at Wells Fargo Arena. And then October 1st through 4th, we're going to have the fall fundraiser. So make sure to go to iowacatholicradio.com to check all those things out and make sure to be a part of the show. To get started a little bit, a hint, as it were, at the fall fundraiser, please prayerfully consider giving your gift to Iowa Catholic Radio, because this ministry is more than just the people on air, behind the boards, or behind the desks. This is your ministry as well. We thank everyone who donates their time and their prayers, but yes, your treasure as well makes this possible. So please prayerfully consider giving a gift to Iowa Catholic Radio. You can do that at iowacatholicradio.com or call 515-223-1150. We look forward to hearing from you and hopefully participation in the fall fundraiser. So, Bud, you looked a little shocked about looking at the...
I'm going to have to study the programming handout. I just, the Advent tradition of writing in chalk above your door. Uh-huh. You can write 4:30, 10, 3:56. No, next week I'll make sure I have the times down pat. But you can also, if you want to use the app, I'm not going to wake up at 4:30 to pray the rosary, but you can use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to do so anytime.
That sounds very just. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, planet, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for the Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.